Heather McMillan-Nakai. She is a dynamic attorney. I'll let her tell you a little bit more about her work and who she works for and what she's doing. But it was through her own genealogy research that took her to where she is now that really is a lot about those tips and tricks of digging in deeper places and looking at different things.
Good morning, everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces. But those of you who don't know me, my name is Heather McMillan-Nakai. I'm the daughter of Margaret Carter McMillan and Herbert McMillan, the granddaughter of Marcella Carter, Locklear Carter, Brady Locklear, Warren Lincoln McMillan, and Llewellyn Jacobs McMillan. So, as Nancy said, I'm a lawyer. And when I was about 18 years old, I was working at Indian Education. I might have been 19. I should rewind. When I was about 5 or 6, somebody said, "The way you talk, Heather, you're probably going to be a lawyer." That couldn't have been more true. And when I was 19 years old, I had gone off to Dartmouth, where I did my undergraduate work, and I had got a grant to go work at Indian Education. Mr. Bruce Barton was still working there at the time. And he said, "Heather, what you gonna do with that fancy Dartmouth degree? You could have got an American Indian Studies degree right here and saved your people a lot of money." And I said, "Mr. Bruce, I'm gonna go fix the Lumbee problem." And he said, "What now?" I said, "I'm gonna be a lawyer. We got a lot of problems, but that one problem from the book, I'm gonna go get that cleared up." He said, "Well, all right then," and laughed at me because I was 19. And about in June of 2016, 16, I called Mr. Bruce and said, "Hey, Mr. Bruce, this is Heather." He said, "Girl, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, exactly what I told you I was going to." He said, "What?" I said, "In about 2 weeks, I'm going to go file a lawsuit in federal district court to start clearing up the Lumbee problem." And he said, "You're kidding." And I was like, "I'm not. I'm going to bring you a copy." Well, most of you probably know that I wasn't able to do that because shortly thereafter we lost Mr. Bruce. But I did file that federal lawsuit. But as Nancy mentioned, and probably let me tell you the end of that story, is I filed the federal lawsuit, and that cleared up what had long been an unlawful interpretation of the Lumbee Act. When it was passed in 1956, the Department of Interior had an agenda. They went to Congress and tried to enforce that agenda. They were only mildly successful. Mildly because the language they asked for, they did not get. They did get a phrase out of the 2 full sentences they submitted into the legislation. But unfortunately, what they were able to do, which is the federal agency's job, is to interpret the legislation. Now, often when new legislation is passed, the agency will go out and interpret it and start enforcing it. And because generally it's to a large group of people, particularly when it's Indian legislation, there are lawyers all over the place challenging them on everything that they do. We didn't have that. We didn't have a large group of people. We didn't have lawyers who could go challenge that interpretation. So day one, June 8th, 1956, until December 30th of 2016, they said that the Lumbee Act both recognized us and terminated us, and that we were not entitled to benefits programs provided to Indians because of their status as Indians, because we had never received those programs, been entitled before, and we are not entitled now. They were wrong. They acknowledged that at the end of 2016 after filing federal legislation. But how did genealogy get me there? Nancy is going to find the handout. Do you guys have books with a handout in it from 2 copies of a census record on the same page? If you could pull that out, it would be really helpful. If you don't have a copy, find a neighbor who does. It's just 2 census records on the same page, and it should have ovals and arrows.
They come along. So it's going to take them.
Did anybody find it? Yeah. census record with two side by side. Two different pages side by side, no?
If it's not in there, I printed some more, it may not.
Does anybody have a copy of the 1900 or 1910 census of the
Is it handwritten? No.
Okay, anyway, let's talk about it. Don't look for it anymore. Miss Nancy's gonna help us out, get a digital version, and we can talk anyway.
Okay.
So early in my career, when I graduated from law school, I went to work for the Indian Health Service, which is a federal agency that provides health care to Indians. I'm a go-getter. Those of you who know me know that I don't ever dawdle when it comes to my profession. And in a short year, I became the eligibility expert for the director, which meant that after an individual had requested service and been denied, the ultimate appeal is to the director of the Indian Health Service. And it was my job to make recommendations to the director for whether someone satisfied the definition of Indian. And when I say the definition of Indian, that's facetious. There are probably 100 definitions of the word Indian in federal law. The groups sometimes are this big, it's this big, it's global, it's just one tribe. It was my job to know all of those definitions. Well, one of them is the definition of Indian in the Indian Reorganization Act. And the way that somebody satisfies that definition is that they submit federal censuses that determine the tribal affiliation and blood quantum of the individual. Now, those have happened across Indian country, across America, in a variety of capacities. There are judgment rolls when there's been a fund established by Congress for a tribe. The BIA would go out and census the tribe and determine who was entitled to funds from that judgment roll. There were censuses of reservations and tribal communities. And universally, what's unique about those censuses is that they not only list the usual census data that we're all familiar with, it will determine the blood quantum of that individual and what tribe they are affiliated with. Those are records that Indian country universally uses to establish their eligibility for programs any number of ways. Well, about 2010, Frank, tell me if I'm wrong, was about the epitome when we all got access to Ancestry.com.
Amen.
And we started pulling those records down while I was right there with y'all. And was very, very surprised, shocked even though I'm an actively enrolled Lumbee and I'm really engaged with my tribal community. When someone would say to me that we used our 1900 and 1910 base rolls, I'm not sure that I ever critically understood what they were saying. What they meant was that the United States government, the Department of Interior, had come to Robeson County, which is why you don't find our ancestors who were in Georgia at the time on these rolls, and conducted what's called an Indian census. That's different than a regular census. It has different legal import, and it's very, very useful if you're trying to establish that you're an Indian under the law, because it identifies your tribal affiliation and your blood quantum. Okay, well that was 1900. Is there anyone in this room who thinks they might have been on the 1900 census? Probably not. Okay, so then it just becomes, for someone who's only 30, which is I think how old I was at the time, a question of math and how good I was at fractions. So I have 2 Lumbee parents, 4 Lumbee grandparents, 8 Lumbee great-grandparents. I was able to go back to the 1900 census and pull them all down. Miss Ruth Locklear at the time was very helpful in getting my tribal chart, my little chart from the enrollment office. Yes.
Do you want to
yes, it would help if I.
The front row might not have got.
So I went to Ancestry.com and pulled down all these handy records on everybody. And the copy you have here is my great-grandma Polly, and you see the little red arrow out beside her name. I used her on both examples to demonstrate the difference.
Is this Senator Lawrence?
No, this is literally my great-grandma. She's not old enough to be. Her great-grandma was Henry Berry Lowry's sister, Mary. Half-sister, I think. Anyway, this was just 1900. What year is this? 1940 is at the top, and 1900 is at the bottom. So you have 1940 at the top and 1900 at the bottom. One is an Indian census. The 1900 census, which is our base roll, is an Indian census. And you see at the top I've circled Indian population. And I put the little red arrow besides Grandma Polly's name. And then a little star down, because what you have to know is when you look at an Indian census, it's this short at the top because there are only however many people are here, 12 or something. Because they have to go down and bring their names down and give you the special Indian data. Their blood quantum, their tribal affiliation, whether they live in a movable house or a fixed structure. In other words, do they live in a teepee? Or do they have a front door in the house? And to be honest, as a lawyer, I saw this and I couldn't believe it. Who knew that there had ever been a federal census of the Lumbees? I can tell you how little anyone in the federal Indian law world knew. There's a lawyer who represented some of our tribal members back in the 70s on whether they satisfied the definition of Indian under the IRA. And when I called him and told him what I was doing, he was very polite, and I sounded very young. On the phone, it's worse. And he said, Heather, I don't mean to be rude, dear, but there's no way you're old enough to have been one of the 22. How are you going to prove that you're blood quantum? How are you going to prove you're a half-blood Indian? And I said, with the federal Indian census of my tribe. And he said, what federal Indian census of my tribe, of your tribe? And I said, our base rolls are the 1900 and 1910 census of our tribe. He said, are you telling me that there was a census of your whole tribe that established their blood quantum? I said, I am. He said, why didn't anyone ever tell me that? And I was like, they didn't know that it mattered. Because how many of you have seen this 1900 census of your people and not thought to yourself anything more than, that's different, and went on about your day? Okay, well, I'm a lawyer, and I'd spent all this time looking at other Indians and how they established that they're Indian, including family Bibles are accepted in South Dakota. And here we got a whole federal Indian census. They weren't going door to door and had two forms. You look like you might be an Indian, I'll put you on this form and going to your neighbor and he was white and putting him on a different form. No, this is a whole different census. Different census. So I collected all this data, and this is how I'm challenging the department's treatment, not just of me as an individual, but ultimately all of us collectively. Because the department used this federal census to establish their budget justifications for every year from 1890 until 1940.
That's why they say there's $1 trillion up there.
Every single year. So when they say, we never provided you service, well, they're mostly right. But I wouldn't have said that out loud if I were there. And there's congressional testimony about this transition and how Grandma Polly ended up on the census in 1940, not this census. And it's because there was a gentleman by the name of Darcy McNichol, and I'm gonna line him all over, and I should feel bad and I don't, who was presenting the budget justification for the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1941. And that budget justification has population totals. And in 1939, the population totals of Indians had been somewhere in the range of about 356,000. Well, in 1941, it was down to 327,000 or some such. However many of us there were no longer counted. And the congressman, an astute congressman, said, Mr. McNichol, I happen to notice that last year was really 1940. You had this many Indians, and this year you only got this many Indians. Was there a plague we didn't know about? What's happened? Where did they go? And he said, Congressman, well, you know, that what's happened is, for the last however many years, the Census Bureau has been censusing those Indians in Robeson County and including them in the totals. But we don't consider them Indians. And we don't provide them service. So I went down there and told them to stop doing that. And this year they did. And the congressman, as astute as he is, says, but for the last however many years, we've been appropriating money for you to provide services to those Indians. What you been doing with that money? And Mr. McNichol had a very reasonable explanation. He said, well, you know what, Congressman? There are these people in Oklahoma. And they're not Indians, but they're entitled to treaty rights. Now that seems strange. What do you mean they're not Indians, but they're entitled to treaty rights? What he meant was how did Melinda describe it last night? The racial connotations to what really is political status met head on in that testimony. What he meant was, by his definitions of race, they weren't racially Indian, but politically they were. They weren't racially Indian because they went to school, they spoke English, their pants probably had zippers, and they had front doors on their physical structures. But they were enrolled Cherokee members entitled to treaty rights. And so he said, we've been using that money that y'all been appropriating for them Indians in Robinson County to provide those Indians with treaty rights, because they're not calculated. The next census, they'll be counted as Indians because of political status. But, so that's what we've been doing. We didn't have a lawyer or anything, anyone who cared in the room to say, now wait a minute. That's not how that works. You can't just willy-nilly go spend money. And it passed unnoticed. And except that I searched for Indian and Robinson in the same Google search in databases that I have access to, I never would have known that, because how many of you have ever heard that story? There are numbers of things that if you've heard any of my lectures, you'll hear just like that. Stories that we just don't know because we haven't had the resources to look. But genealogy is the answer, at least in short order. And so what has happened in my case is that I sued the government and they changed the Lumbee Act interpretation, and now I'm suing them again to actually enforce the law this time. And my goal is that all of you who pull these records down, start doing your math, start doing your fractions. There might be a math teacher in this room who can help us all if we've gotten rusty on the fractions. Because the way I established I was eligible, I would estimate, and the enrollment office, some folks are here, I'm seeing this right now, this is here. Most Lumbees would be at least a half-blood if you have two parents who are on the base roll, or two immediate ancestors. Because you could have two ancestors, and that would be the only two ancestors you got, and your math number might not work out. Yes, sir.
The most common designation they gave per page was half or full. Sometimes in the 1900 they might be listed as full, sometimes in 1910 they might be listed as half, but you'd probably be eligible to use the higher designation, but it was typically the page was.
And I'm litigating that right now, just September 1st. We received a decision from the Bureau of Indian Affairs that said because my ancestors on the 1900 census were listed as full bloods, and on the 1910 census they were 3/4, that those are inconsistent and therefore unreliable. Okay, well I'm going to mail them pages of the dictionary, that's okay, because that's not what either of those words mean in plain English. And I'm also going to explain to them the difference between racial designation and political designation. And just because in 1900, great-grandpa whoever didn't string a sentence together the way that soul wanted him to, and let's be honest, he was probably out somewhere on the tractor and that man called him in from the field and he was mad, so he was probably spitting mad and probably spoke the same kind of English both years, but he was mad the first time. Oh, behind people, I know, I don't know why I said that. But they were mad. And so maybe in 1900 they hadn't got a foundation for the house, and the house was just dirt floors. And maybe in 1910 they had gotten a foundation. Or maybe the man they sent out to take the census was just a little more racist in 1910 than the guy in 1900. Whatever the case, it didn't change the political status. Because being Indian is not just a cultural designation, it is a political designation. And in 1920 or so, a BIA official came down here and said, is it clear what traditional tribes they descend from? And Kay and I were just talking about this. But wherever they came from and whatever their racial makeup, they are being treated as Indians in the courts of law. We have to do something. If Congress doesn't do anything else, we ask that they deploy an agent from the Department of Justice to protect these people, because they are being faced with courts and juries that are not their peers. We need to they're being treated as Indians regardless of what they might genetically actually be. And at the end of the day, that's the end of the conversation. Not how Indian am I, or how many of my ancestors looked a particular way, or whether they can get a pencil through my hair, because they not, y'all can see. And that's what they said, that the only reliable records we have was the pencil test. They said that September 1st of 2018. And so what I said to the lawyer at the Department of Interior was, where's your pencil, and if somebody scratches me, we're going to
This is not a good day.
So, the answer though is to know our genealogy. We know our history, we know our people, but having conferences like this where we can talk about it, because I always tell people who say, Heather, you're always just talking at us, and I was like, you're wrong, I'm only talking to you because I think you know something I don't know, and I know if I say enough, I'm going to trigger whatever button I need to trigger for you to then tell me that thing I don't know. Because I learn something every time I talk to a single soul at the food line, or the Piggly Wiggly, which is really my preferred grocery store, or in big conferences like this. You remember moments in history I never knew existed, like Melinda was talking yesterday and that young man was saying, I never even heard that story. Well, Lord Jesus, we're going to get him into Lumbee history class. But we all need to go to Lumbee history class. I need to go to Lumbee history class in the 1940s and 50s. We have a Lumbee history class right here. So when you're looking at your genealogy, if you see an interesting thing, collect business cards, call the museum, whatever. And
utilize our message board over here.
utilize the message board, find one of us, and let's talk about the quirks of history. Because those quirks that are in your family may not be in mine. I got a great grandma that disappeared after 1920, and I would love to know where she's at.
So what does Indian mean in 1956
What does it mean?
in terms of the language used by the Lumbees?
Indian and federal Indian. Okay. Dr. Earl, have you heard me tell this story? Do you ever heard me give this moment of information? The word Indian, capital I, is how I talk about it. When the word Indian, capital I, is used in federal law, it means something. It's a political designation. It's not a racial designation. It cannot be. The Constitution prohibits that. You can't be little I Indian in federal law because that would be unconstitutional. The Constitution prevents discrimination against people because of their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their political affiliation. And so Congress can't pass laws for the Chinese people of California. They can't pass laws for the black folks of Southern Florida. That's unconstitutional. So when they passed legislation in 1956 for the Indians of Robinson County, and they called us the Lumbee Indians, they established a political relationship existed. They didn't establish the relationship because it had existed long before that. But they acknowledged that it existed as of that moment. They couldn't have passed the legislation if they had not been establishing that designation. If it weren't already there, they couldn't have passed the legislation.
So they just turned that back, though, in the child welfare. They said it's
So one court, I love Judge Dale Dees, but just because he says something in court today does not mean it's going to be true all over the country. Nor any other judge, Brooke or whoever else is on the bench in Robinson County. Sorry, I just saw Judge Dees this week. But that's just one judge in one little tiny place in Texas, and they shopped him. That lawyer filed that case in his court from 350 miles away. They judge shopped him. We should all be fighting against that. But right now what's happening is these records are in question. And because it's this kind of record, it's hopefully going to get Indian country on our boat, because all of Indian country relies on records like this. So if the BIA says these are not valid, they're telling that to all of Indian country.
Well, and I think an important point too, sorry I had to step out, you may have already made this, is that yesterday we had enrollment give a presentation and say that our base rolls are determined by the 1900 and 1910 census. So they're upholding one law that they have said we have to follow to the letter to discount another to her, and using the law in a different way for the same record.
Fork of the tongue.
Yeah, slip of the tongue.
And I came running through the door yesterday when Ms. Rita was talking about that, because I wanted to jump in and say, and when she says base roll, it's not a base roll we prepared. It's a base roll the federal government prepared. And my argument for the reason that matters is because when they prepared that roll, they were establishing political status for everyone who's on it. They didn't just acknowledge a fact that existed, They told the whole world that we were different, which allowed those people to take our land and to not treat us fairly. They told the world we were different than our neighbors and that we had to be censused separately. And for that, they are also accountable. So they can't have their cake and eat it too. They can't go collect a budget and tell the whole world we're Indians and should be treated as such, but then turn around and say, but they weren't really Indians.
This is just Robinson County?
Frank, do you have Hope County records like this? Hope County didn't exist in 1900.
Yeah, what area, I mean, what, do we know?
Hope was part
Or
of
Robinson.
Robinson, Moore, and Cumberland County.
Right, so the parts of these other counties that are in our tribal territory now were included in Robinson County at the time, and so they're probably on this Robinson County census.
There's just few of them.
It's just-
What is presently Hope, there's just very few compared
Right.
to the numbers that's in Robinson.
But they won't be separated on their own little Hope County, because the Hope County didn't exist. They're on the same censuses as we are. You had a question?
Any parts of South Carolina on there?
There's another expert in this room. Frank and Nancy about the South Carolina censuses. I don't know about them. I don't have no ancestors who ever lived in South Carolina, as far as I know, except the one that is.
Well, just across the line, they are designated as Indian.
There's a few that's in the regular census, designated in, but
Yeah,
it's very few. South Carolina had a much more
I mean,
pattern, if you will, of naming those people as white, not that they self-identify that way, they just had a much more narrow pattern. There's very few, but they're in the regular census, they're not in a special Indian census like we had here.
And that's what is different too, is the Department of Interior was laying out the sovereign territory of the tribe. They were recognizing sovereignty by doing this. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
I know that as far away as Columbia, Warrensburg, South Carolina, there were censoring Chavis families as quarantine.
That's what it
As quarantine.
Okay. So there's the answer to that. You had,
I work in tribal enrollment, as she mentioned, and I heard an interesting statement yesterday. I can't remember who said it. I kind of overheard the conversation, but they were talking about the irony of us using these census records as base rolls, because what they were implying is we as a people, in selecting these records as our base rolls, didn't understand the ethical impact of these records themselves. And like Ms. Heather said, and I think this is what that person was alluding to, these records were created to set us aside so that we could be treated in a different way from our neighbors, because we had all been kind of lumped in together up to that point. And that was something that I hadn't really understood until today, when she was telling me that now people who were after us, after our resources, had records to go to say, well, okay, you know, this person, you know, is Indian, you know, they've got a lot of land that I want, so now I have a way to go after them, you know, because I know for a fact they're not white. They might look at this census says it, and I think that that's, you know, a really interesting, you know, kind of dialogue on that, because I think it also speaks to, because you're taking this same thing that was used as a discriminatory measure and turning it around for our benefit. So I think that in our push forward, that's what we need to do, take the things that were used against us and turn it around and throw it back at them and say, you know, well, okay, you know, this is tit for tat, you know, I'm going to use this to, you know, help my people out now.
I want to add to that. So we think about the census rolls, or the census as, you know, capturing people, but when you look at other tribes, again, you know, I lived in Oklahoma for a long time, so the Dawes rolls are used to establish the base rolls for the Creeks, the Cherokees, the Seminoles, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, right? Right. On the Dawes rolls are their land allotment rolls, okay? You don't have to be Indian, you didn't have to be Indian to be on the Dawes rolls. You could have descent, you could have married in, you could have been a former slave or a freeman, you could have had straight white ancestry but had aligned yourself with these people because of trade, because there were people that were removed themselves as part of Indian removal to stay in line with the business, and then they got lumped in with community, and then they got on the Dawes rolls. And so that's what establishes their base rolls. So they may not have any Cherokee blood at all, or Choctaw blood, or Chickasaw blood, but if they're on that Dawes roll, and they can point to an ancestor on that Dawes roll, then that's what makes them Indian. Then there's another thing, real quick, Kate, I'll get that, is that also, like in Oklahoma, if you have multiple different parents, and we talked about how your tribe establishes, each tribe establishes their rules for enrollment. Like my friend's grandson is Delaware, Choctaw, Caddo, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Apache, and he's full blood, and he's not enough of any of those to be enrolled in a tribe. So even though he's full Indian, he can't enroll with anybody.
Wow. Miss Susan Ann's had her.
I'm sorry, yes. I'm sorry.
If you notice on Ancestry.com sometimes, if you're looking at these census, somebody in Lumberton or whoever, sometimes the census taker would put Indians in with the white people. And then they marked all of that out when it got there, and they took it off the census he took and put it on the Indian census.
I would need to see examples of that.
I see it on Ancestry.com a lot when I'm researching.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if anyone has immediately got one of those, I would need to see those for legal reasons, because I would.
They're marked out if they're Indian. Somebody had to look at these when they were turned in because the census people that was out there taking it, put them on the white rolls, and then they were marked off and they were added to the Indian rolls. I've seen that dozens of times.
I need a master's student in American Indian Studies. If y'all know any who are looking for a project.
So let's talk about real quick about what are the motives with census records, okay, and identifying community. So census records are used to establish how many people are in a community, how many federal resources are going to go into a community, how populations are growing, who's there, how civic communities can use those. So say for the town of Pembroke, they'll look at census records and they want to do, a business wants to do planning. Who's the demographic, what's the population, will my job, or will my industry work there? So even going way back, so you could say, yes, there's X number of Indians, like you would see sometimes in the early censuses. And then you start seeing mulatto, right? Because that's reflecting culture. Oh yes, we have in the South mixed peoples that are industrious and living side by side and shoulder to shoulder, but we don't have any Indians because Indians can be problems. We're still deemed as problems. And up until 1924, Indians weren't even citizens of the United States, and we were considered hostiles of the United States government.
Can I
Who
jump in
wanted to move
there?
their house next door to the hostiles of the United States government?
And in Robeson County, until that happened, if you were an Indian,
You were
then the
one.
land you lived on was vacant.
Yes.
And so you see land reports from Robeson County about 370,000 vacant acres in Robeson County. And they could say they were vacant because you were on the Indian census, because when they looked at the regular population census, you weren't on it.
Yeah. So see how it's called, and then you can look at, okay, you move forward to when is it, the 30s or 40s when it becomes Indian, because Indians aren't necessarily a threat anymore. We've kind of moved a little further in society. So you can be Indian again. And that's called paper genocide. They manipulate how you look on paper. We didn't change, we didn't evolve, we didn't stop being Indian and become something else, and then we're Indian again. We kind of talked about that this morning. It's what is the best for how that the United States wants to look at that area and what are the intentions for that place.
And in that moment, we were down to 3,000 acres. So it was okay to put Indians on 3,000 acres. We can't put Indians on 375,000 acres.
There you go.
That's my great-grandfather. I did a lot of research on the Allens and the Lewises and the Holmes and a lot here. That's my family. And they had my grandfather down, great-grandfather down, 4 different races. They had him as white. Now, you can't change colors, I don't think, anyway. But they had him Indian, mulatto, and black. So I guess it's according to who took the census. And don't put a lot of faith in it because some of the things are not right. I asked my father. And he knew his father, and his father knew his father. And that's where I got most of mine before I really went on Ancestry, because the information is good and it's helpful, but it's not always, you know. He said one census he said he was full-blooded Cherokee. This was later on down the line. He changed from black to mulatto, to Indian, and then now you put you as Cherokee, you know, that's what they called them Cherokee back in that day anyway.
Who the government needed him to be at the time.
It is absolutely true.
So
And it would be
money
a
was
good
involved somewhere, you
project.
know. An Indian is not worth as much as a white man or whatever.
They could take his land if he was Indian, they couldn't take it if he was white.
One of the problems was that the enumerators were were white.
That too.
There were no Indians that did that until later years, decades.
Okay.
Right, and so there's so many legal intricacies. I want you to see this as this massive mountain I can't climb by myself. I'm just on one tiny little path. I hope this is gonna turn into a seriously academic conference, because what you just described is a perfect case study for an academic to do research and discover what his tax status was, his land holdings, how they changed with how his identity changed on the census, how programmatic programs he was personally participating in, how their budgets changed based on how he was defined on the census. And we could pick one ancestor, and y'all know we got a bazillion ancestors. That's a bazillion master's or PhD theses. So that's ultimately where this genealogy, I hope, as the lawyer in me hopes it goes, because these things are very important. And as I've said here before, the truth in a story is in the tell of the teller, and we have not been telling our stories. And it's time that we start doing that, and not just doing it with what we know, but becoming true academics and embracing and going further and learning why it mattered that he was a mulatto or black or white or purple people eater.
Are you open to individuals in this symposium to submit their discrepancies in their research to you in your efforts of what you're trying to do in federal
I think
court?
one thing would be good is for her to say, because I've become very familiar with Heather, and I know that what she says gives us a lot of questions. So I think if you could say to us what your needs are, where you're at, where you see this going, and then how could you be because you right now have your own agenda that is very full,
Right.
along with her job that she works. And then could you be a resource, just like Millie's saying, to folks who see
Because a lot of
these?
people in here have done extensive research on their individual families and have seen these discrepancies and questioned why things are the way they are. Would their research compiled individually and presented to you for your records?
I think the easiest way to do that, because I never want anyone to see anything I do as my records, right? It's not Heather's thing. I'm just the mouthpiece for a whole nation. If you have a specific discrepancy that you think you see a pattern of, if you could write it out here, and if you're having trouble phrasing it, find me or somebody, Nancy, and let us write. Nancy has these wonderful boards out here for just this purpose. Write your discrepancy down, and if you see a discrepancy that you have found in your records, write your name there, because what Alicia means is I work full-time and I have a 4-year-old, and I'm suing the federal government, and it's an appeals process right now, so I really don't have I rarely have time. But if you can list your discrepancies out here and list your name, if I see something that's legally going to help me right now, I probably will follow up on it, but it'll be a little while before I can. But there are other people who you're going to hear from today. You're going to hear from Miss Olivia, you're going to hear from Frank later today. There's some other folks who really are genealogical historians. And I should be out there when it comes to genealogical history, listening to experts. I just happen to have used it this one really tiny way. But if we can get those discrepancies listed out here, and let's figure out if it's a pattern or if it's just one person.
Gotcha.
Like Ms. Barbara said, get it funded and make it a project.
Well, and tell them how they can help,
Yeah.
whether that be monetary or.
We're looking at ways to fundraise and develop, because ultimately the dream would be to have a Lumbee Research Center where we're preserving all of this data and information and intellect, and I've been working with some folks to figure out a way to do that, to fund that, so that we're not, you don't want, for example, I walk around with a USB key and I just like stick it in random Lumbee laptops because if something happens to me or my computer crashes, I don't want to lose everything I have because it crashed, and I don't want any of you doing that either. So give it to your kids, don't even have to tell them what it is, just like stick it on their laptops, stick it on their computers, put it in a fire stick. Because so much of what we have has not been explored, and we won't be able to do it in one lifetime.
can't do it by ourselves.
Thank you.